Beneath the shroud of London, dense fog that settled over London was as ancient as the city itself, seeping into the cobblestone streets and clinging to the walls of every building. It was a suffocating presence, a heavy shroud that choked the life out of the bustling city. By day, it was merely an inconvenience, a gray haze that made the sun seem distant and the days short. But by night, it transformed the city into a labyrinth of shadow and dread. The year was 1888, and the city was a web of secrets. The East End, in particular, was a tangle of narrow alleys and dimly lit streets where the poor and desperate scraped together a living. It was in these streets that something darker than the fog began to take root, something that fed on the fear and despair of the city's most vulnerable. Sarah Blackwood had lived in London all her life. She knew the streets of Whitechapel like the back of her hand, from the bustling market on Brick Lane to the crumbling tenements that lined the side streets. Her mother had died when she was a girl, and her father was lost to drink and gambling, leaving Sarah to fend for herself. She had learned early on how to survive in the city, how to navigate the dangerous waters of poverty and crime. But even she was not prepared for what was to come. The first sign that something was amiss came on a cold October night. Sarah was making her way home after a long day at the market, her hands still smelling of fish and onions. The fog was thick that evening, swirling around her like a living thing. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, quickening her pace as she passed by the darkened alleys. She had always been cautious, always aware of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. But tonight, the shadows seemed to watch her, to follow her every move. She turned a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the middle of the street, was a figure, tall and thin. It stood still as a statue, facing her. The fog seemed to part around it, as though repelled by its presence. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run. But she was rooted to the spot, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure. It took a step toward her, and she caught a glimpse of its face, pale and gaunt. The skin stretched tightly over the bones, the eyes were dark and hollow, like bottomless pits. It wore a long, black coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over its face. Sarah felt her heart race, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Help me," she whispered, though she knew there was no one around to hear her. The figure took another step, and Sarah finally found the strength to move. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cobblestones as she fled down the street. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the figure's eyes on her, could sense it following her through the fog. She burst into her small, one-room apartment, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her heart was pounding so loudly in her ears that she barely heard the faint sound of footsteps outside her door. She pressed her back against the wood, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a soft, scratching sound began. It was barely audible, like the sound of nails scraping against the wood. It started at the bottom of the door and slowly moved upward, as though something was trying to claw its way inside. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a scream. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and she could feel the door shaking under the force of whatever was outside. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. Sarah stood frozen in place, her ears straining to catch any sound. She waited for what felt like hours, her back pressed against the door, her heart still racing. But there was nothing, only the silence and the oppressive weight of the fog outside. She waited until dawn before she dared to move. When she finally unlocked the door and peered outside, the street was empty. There was no sign of the figure, no trace of the scratching on the door. But Sarah knew what she had seen, what she had heard. Something was out there, something that was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched never left her. She would catch glimpses of the figure in the fog, standing at the end of an alley or across the street, always just out of reach, always watching. She tried to tell herself that it was her imagination, that the fog was playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew that it was real. That whatever it was, it had marked her, and she wasn't the only one. Word began to spread through the East End of strange occurrences, of people disappearing without a trace. It started with the homeless, those who had no family, no one to notice if they were gone. Then it was the prostitutes, women who walked the streets at night, their bodies found mutilated in the most gruesome ways. The newspapers dubbed the killer Jack the Ripper, and the entire city was gripped by fear. But Sarah knew that this was no ordinary killer. She had seen the figure, had felt its presence. This was something far worse than a man with a knife. This was something ancient, something that fed on fear and despair, something that had awakened in the fog. She began to investigate, talking to the few friends she had in the city, asking about any strange occurrences. Most people were too frightened to speak, but she managed to find a few who had seen the figure, who had felt its eyes on them. They all described the same thing: a tall, thin figure with a pale, gaunt face, always shrouded in fog. As the days passed, the sense of dread grew. The fog seemed to thicken, to become almost alive, pressing in on the city from all sides. The streets were deserted at night, the fear of the Ripper keeping people locked inside their homes. But Sarah knew that the Ripper was not the only thing to fear. She could feel the figure getting closer, could sense its hunger. She began to have nightmares, dark, twisted visions of the figure standing over her, its hollow eyes staring down at her as it reached out with long, bony fingers. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, the sound of the scratching still echoing in her ears. The figure was always there, in the corner of her vision, just out of reach. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a sound outside her window. It was a low, mournful wail, like the wind howling through the trees. But there were no trees in Whitechapel, and the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. She got up and went to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The street was empty, the fog swirling in thick, impenetrable clouds. But she could hear the wailing, closer now, as though it were right outside her door. She backed away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The wailing grew louder, more insistent, and she could feel the cold seeping into her bones. Suddenly, the door burst open with a crash, and the figure was there, standing in the doorway. Its eyes were black, bottomless pits, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. It stepped into the room, and the temperature dropped, the air growing so cold that Sarah could see her breath. She backed away, her hands trembling, but there was nowhere to go. The figure loomed over her, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It reached out with one long, bony hand, and Sarah felt the cold seep into her skin, into her very soul. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, her voice frozen in her throat. The figure leaned in close, its breath cold against her cheek. "You cannot escape me," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "I am the darkness, the fear that consumes all. And now? You are mine." Sarah felt her body go numb, the cold spreading through her veins. The figure's hand closed around her throat, and she felt her life slipping away, like sand through her fingers. She struggled, but it was no use. The figure's grip was unyielding, its power absolute. As the darkness closed in around her, she saw the figure's face change, its features shifting, morphing into something more monstrous, more terrifying. It was no longer human, but a creature of nightmare, a thing of pure evil. And in that moment, Sarah knew that she was lost. The last thing she heard before the darkness consumed her was the sound of the figure's laughter, cold and cruel, echoing through the fog-choked streets of London. Sarah Blackwood was found dead the next morning, her body cold and lifeless, her eyes wide open in terror. There were no signs of a struggle, no wounds or marks on her body. The police were baffled, chalking it up to yet another victim of the Ripper, though there were no similarities to the previous murders. But those who knew the truth, those who had seen the figure in the fog, knew better. They knew that something far worse than Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of London, something that fed on fear and despair, something that was always watching, always waiting.